The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Today's episode is Fear, Faith, and Horror.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's your host, Wade Franson, Created in the Image of God. We are on episode 213 today. Can hardly believe that. It's like a fantasy. That's like a movie of my life, which is maybe the segue into today's show. I have a guest in the studio. His name is Josh Larson. He has dedicated his life to movies of a particular genre. I don't want to scare you by telling what it is because I don't want you to tune out. But stay tuned and you'll find out more about his life's work. He's a respected I'll let him tell exactly. Veteran film critic, author, and co-host of the long-running podcast and radio show Film Spotting, with 30 years of experience, even though he doesn't look a day over 29. Welcome to the studio, Josh.
Well, thank you, Wade. Wow, what a kind introduction. And though I will say, I jumped scared myself when you said I dedicated my life to horror movies. I definitely love them.
I didn't say that. I didn't.
Okay.
I said to a certain genre, and I don't want to scare people. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking, man, do I love horror movies?
That strongly.
Do I love horror movies that much? I do. I'm just fascinated by them endlessly. Have been as a young kid, younger than I probably should have been fascinated by them, which I've found is a recurring experience for people who've come to love them. Actually, there's probably some psychology beyond that, but yeah, still enjoy watching them and thinking about them today.
Well, and I was one of those kids. I was sharing with you as we were getting reacquainted in the studio. What I didn't share is I have a 17-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. We're just back from Hawaii. He had his friends over for a sleepover when they're back. And guess what? They all had to watch a horror movie.
Yep, of course. That's when it usually starts. And then so for some people, maybe even a little bit younger.
Well, that's a great segue into our first segment. When did it start for you? What's your creation story? Who were your parents? What Amityville did you grow up in?
Yeah, my horror origin story. My parents are somewhat involved, though I should say, grew up in a Christian household. This would have been late 70s, early 80s when I was young. And, church at that time, twice a day on Sundays. We were, fairly religious in our practice, but also fairly engaged with the culture at large. So I'd like to say my parents were discerning in what I could watch. I definitely had my limits, but they weren't fearful. And my dad in particular loved movies. So going to the movies with the family was a regular thing. The latest, blockbusters playing in the 80s, we would go see. And so they were open to me as a person of faith from a young age. Now, I don't know if the first horror movies I saw were open to me, as my parents might know, because I ended up watching them. And to put an age on it, I was maybe in third, fourth grade, something like this. But my family also had a Sunday tradition after the evening church service of gathering at a house. It would rotate whose house. My grandmother had a number of sisters, all lived in the area in the suburbs of Chicago. And every Sunday it would be a different house. After church, we would go and the adults would have ham buns. I don't know if that's just a Midwest thing, but we'd all have ham buns. The adults then would go for coffee and talk upstairs and send the kids usually to a basement. And they were done with us. This was that era where kids get out. We'll hope you're alive in a couple hours when it's time to take you home. And so we would play games, board games, that sort of stuff. And the younger kids, younger than me, would start to drop off and fall asleep as, the hours went to 9 p.m., 10 p.m., sometimes 11. And then the older kids, myself and maybe some teenagers, turn on the TV. And what would you find? A lot of times later at night, horror movies being replayed on local stations. And that's where I first saw Psycho, a version of Psycho. That's where I first saw The Shining. Maybe two of the scariest movies, horror movies to have been made. These were edited for TV versions. I will say that. So it wasn't like I was getting the raw material, but still just terrified me and fascinated me at the same time, and probably planted that seed for when I would go on to explore horror movies more in depth as I got older.
Wow. So those are the two seminal movies. Are there any others that jump out at you?
That early, a lot of them from that era would be ones I was not allowed to see, and they weren't on TV yet. So I'm thinking of Nightmare on Elm Street, which turns out to be now my favorite horror movie of all time. Something like Friday the 13th. I actually have, I'll make this story quick, but was traveling with a best friend's family, very young, younger than third or fourth grade, visiting their relatives in Missouri, I think it was. And one of those situations where you're staying at a stranger's house. I'm with my friend's family. I know them, but you're kind of in a bedroom you don't know. You don't know whose house this was. And again, older kids had watched Friday the 13th. Somehow they had watched it. I think VHS probably at this point. And we saw it as well. My friend and I, who were way too young. I woke up in the middle of the night so scared that I went to find these people's bedroom and asked them to stay up with me because I was too scared to be awake alone. And my friend was no use. He slept fine, slept like a baby. So I was all alone to deal with it.
Wow. So obviously those movies had a huge impact on you, but you didn't stop then. That didn't like stop you from watching horror movies. Why?
Yeah.
Why is that?
Great question. Didn't scare me away. I think maybe just surviving them showed me at some point that, okay, this is a scary thing that you can experience and then have distance from. I could understand if someone had the exact opposite reaction, is like, I don't want to experience that ever again. But for me, maybe it made them survivable. And my love for movies in general kept growing as I got older. By middle school, I knew I wanted to be a film critic. And so at that point, I started watching as many movies as I get my hands on. And I think the love for horror really sunk in maybe a number of years later when I started to learn how to watch movies more as a professional critic, what to look for. And I realized that, a lot of horrors are cheap, exploitative knockoffs. They definitely have that reputation. But the good ones, you can really understand the craft of filmmaking by watching horror movies because they rely so much on the basics, on things like camera position, the use of color, lighting schemes, how to employ music, how to evoke tension. The horror genre is a bedrock genre for understanding the very language of cinema, which is kind of funny because people often think of it as the trashy genre, not to be taken seriously. But if you want to understand how a movie works, you could do worse than looking at well-crafted horror movies.
Are you familiar with the song by Frank Zappa, "Cheapness"?
I'm sure if I heard it playing right now, I would recognize it.
Well,
but
no,
not
it's a deep cut. It was never
okay. Then
right,
no, then no.
But it's about that. It's about, and he has this dialogue, this is pre-rap, of course. It's a Frank Zappa spoken dialogue about the monster in the cave, and you see the cardboard, you see the 2x4 that's moving the monster out and in, right? And the chorus is, "Baby, I'm sorry, that's all I want to know. I need a little more cheapness, please," right? But it's this great, and it's, I guess it has to be the version from a live album that is an obscure album that I got, but for some reason that sticks with me. I'm not a huge Zappa fan, but it evokes that whole thing about the cheap B movie that is nonetheless a pleasure to watch.
Yeah. And it also speaks, I think, a little to seeing the apparatus behind the scare, maybe, which can be demystifying, right? I think maybe that was part of the journey too, is seeing the pieces put together. It demystifies the scariness of it, even though my favorite horror movies are the ones that still scare me.
So what is the criticism of you as a film critic? You
Oh,
know, are you the magician who's explaining the tricks? I mean, how does the world
ah,
respond to?
yeah, I see what you're asking. I think related to that is a question I get a lot, and I think a lot of critics will get is, do you ever just watch a movie for fun? I think that's kind of in the same vein of what you're talking about. And the answer I usually give is that to take movies this seriously and think about them this carefully, to me, is fun. Like, that's how I'm having fun. And I understand, my wife and I will watch a Netflix series maybe that we're both mildly interested in. And that's a different sort of fun. I'm not necessarily, you know, investigating it as closely. I'm maybe letting my guard down, or not putting that critical eye on as extreme as I could. So I understand the distinction they're making, but the honest truth is it's fun for me to watch a movie intensely closely and think about how the filmmakers are achieving what they're achieving, how I might feel about that, what it might speak to me, say to me, the interpretations I might have. That's all fun stuff. So, yeah, I think critics get that rap for spoiling the fun, but honestly, we're having fun.
So as we wrap up this first segment, I want to sort of understand the transition from adolescent to I'm going to become a film critic and that's going to be my career. What did that look like? How does one become a film critic? What concerns, fears, what challenges, and how did you arrive as a film critic?
Yeah, and you're asking this at the end of a year, the start of another year, but as we've just closed out a year where film criticism took a severe blow in terms of being a profession. It's been under attack for a while now, but there were probably 4 or 5 prominent national film critics who lost jobs in 2025. Closest to me would have been the Chicago Tribune's Michael Phillips, who had been there for years. He's a regular guest on our podcast, Film Spotting, one of the nation's best critics, and they eliminated the film critic position. So things are dire now.
Why is that happening?
It's tied to the decimation of media in general, which is a whole nother show we could do. And I'm by no means an expert, but in my experience, starting out in newspapers and moving to the internet and podcasting, in my experience, it's partly just a result of the internet, basically, and the business model changing. It's also part of the fact that media companies, particularly newspapers, have been purchased by investment corporations. And I went through this personally, that bled them dry, bled their staffs thin, and then tried to turn around and sell them for a profit. Almost every important newspaper group in the country has experienced that. And the first thing they go for, as happens at colleges and, in other places, they go for the arts. That's the first thing they think they can eliminate. So those are just two of the factors I can think of right off the top of my head. But film criticism, yeah, it's not honestly a very viable profession. It was always a difficult one. I was fortunate enough to be at the very tail end of the newspaper era where newspapers still had staff film critics. And so that's the route I took, starting out at a daily, weekly newspaper where I just had a column on film, and my main job was covering, the local water rates and school boards, and working my way up from there through other jobs until I did become a daily movie critic for a group of newspapers in the suburbs of Chicago. And this was the same group that also employed Roger Ebert at the Chicago Sun-Times. So it was a golden era that there could be. I can sum it up in this. At that time, there were maybe 15 people in the Chicago area who had a full-time job as a film critic. As I know of right now in 2026, there are 0. Those who are doing that in Chicago are freelancers doing it, being paid not very much per review.
Well, thanks for providing us that background and the context. When we come back from this commercial break, which will be a video about Josh and his work, I want to dive into something that's a little bit more relevant to the general audience of the show, and that is the intersection of your faith, Christianity, your background in that, and this horror genre, and how you reconcile that. Do you see a need to reconcile it, or is that a non-issue? We'll dive into that and more when we come back with celebrated film critic Josh Larson on Created in the Image of God. Don't go anywhere.
Be afraid. Be very afraid.
Oh, no. 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 No, 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 no.
Welcome back to Created in the Image of God. I'm your host, Wade Franson. We're here with Josh Larson, 30-year veteran film critic, survivor in an industry that's in some kind of attrition due to the transformation of the media landscape. I wonder also, and we'll get into the whole Christianity aspect in a minute, but one more follow-on question that I had. There's this whole woke-topia thing, right? And there's this Hollywood desire to go along with woke ideologies and create movies like the new Snow White movie, where this is all politically correct. And traditionally, that has been less of a concern with movies, certainly less of a concern with horror movies who push the envelope. How much does all of that, this ideological divide, play into how the industry is being impacted?
Yeah, that's a big topic on its own. The one thing I can say about it is that from my vantage point, it's less of an ideological divide than a corporate decision. These Hollywood companies, they don't have ideologies, they have shareholders. And so any decisions they make along those lines are a reflection of what they perceive the largest audience wants.
Right, but I think my point is, if you look at the box office results, those were poor economic choices for the stakeholders, for the shareholders, which is causing them to lose money or not make as much money, that's where I'm coming from on that.
And I'd say that's still an economic question. And so you would have to do a deeper dive into, why exactly did that movie fail? Did it fail because of some, allegedly politically correct element, or did it fail because it was boring and ugly, which is what a lot of mainstream Hollywood movies are right now. So I think it's a more complicated issue that, as someone who doesn't cover the business as much, I wouldn't want to speak too far, except to say that to me, it is more of an economic issue than an ideological issue.
Well, but has the horror industry been somewhat immune? Horror movie industry been somewhat immune from some of those ideological concerns because they are already outside accepted norms in a way?
I mean, again, it's more nuanced than this, but the horror genre, I think, reveals that audiences were interested in larger representation of experience and more diverse storytelling. And the horror film that would prove this is Get Out, which was an enormous success from director Jordan Peele, a horror movie that, was exactly about, in the chapter on prophetic horror in my book, I write about Get Out because it was exactly about racism in the United States. And it was an enormous success. So that's where we get into a little bit of difficulty in terms of pointing to box office and saying, well, see, this is evidence of what the audience really wants, because you could always go find another example from the box office that suggests otherwise. And as far as horror, horror has a little bit of freedom because in general, it costs less to produce these movies. And so with that, there's a little less oversight, there's less expectation, or there's less return on your money that's demanded, I should say. So to be a hit in the horror genre often doesn't require as much of a box office return. And with all of that comes a little more flexibility, I think. Maybe that's a distinction related to this that's pertinent when it comes to horror.
Thank you. So let's then get into this issue of religion, Christianity, your background. Is there a need for reconciliation there? Do you reconcile it? How do you how do you address critics who might say, how dare you use the term Christian in any context? And I don't know how much that is or isn't part of your identity and your focus today, but it's certainly your background.
Yeah, it's my background. And yeah, it's very much, I'm fortunate to be able to have a foot in both media arenas, mainstream media, which is where Film Spotting, mostly plays. And then my books are more about film and faith. And up until last year, I worked for Think Christian, a website, podcast, video channel that was all about faith and culture. So I've been able to kind of exist in those two spaces and write and think and talk based on who the audience is. That's where my emphasis is going to be. So yeah, when it comes to horror on that front, I think the first thing I like to keep in mind when I do hear pushback from Christians about the genre is to take their concerns seriously, because I do think they're valid. As I mentioned at the start, horror, there is a segment of horror that is extremely exploitative. I mean, this is a genre that, churns on fear, and to do that sometimes exploits sex, sometimes exploits violence, even violence of the psychological kind. And it's certainly, when it comes to religious horror, there are some films that I think you could fairly call sacrilegious. So I get all of these concerns. I think they are fair in some particular cases, but I don't think they are fair. I don't think it's enough to write off the genre as a whole, because I think there is also, at the same time, some incredibly theologically interesting, affirming, informative, reconciling, to use a word that you used. It's rare in horror to find stories of reconciliation, but when you do, I think they're extra powerful. So I think it's a genre that does offer a lot to people of faith in particular, because of their faith as well. So my position is just, if you want to write it off for those concerns, that's fine. I'm not saying Christians need to watch horror, but I would like to create a space for those who do find value in it, ways for them to engage with it, and they don't have to set their faith aside to do so.
Well, yeah, let's talk about the Bible for a moment. You've got the book of Judges, right, where these most atrocious acts are documented, like chopping up a dead woman and sending her body parts out to various parts of the kingdom, which is a story in the Bible. And then the summary: in those days there was no king in the land, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And then you have, of course, Israel coming out of Egypt, which precedes that, where you have 100-pound hailstones falling and the death of the firstborn by the death angel, right? Pretty horrific. Then you have the book of Revelation, which is like a movie trailer full of horror. You have the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: plagues, pestilence, death. And then you have people shaking their fists at God and covered with boils, right? You have Job sitting on an ash heap covered with boils. I'm laughing now, but these are horror scenarios.
Absolutely. And I do start there with that conversation with Christians who are skeptical, is to say, hey, the Bible is full of horror. You named a number of examples. It starts early on in Genesis with the murder of Abel. And I think It's very interesting that Abel comes back almost like a ghost in scripture, is referenced later on in Matthew and Hebrews even. And then you have, just some more stories. How about Ezekiel and the bones is almost like a zombie,
Yeah,
a
the
reverse
Valley of Dread
zombie
Bones.
story.
All this, flesh is appearing on the bones.
And a terrifying one is, the demons possessing the man that Jesus encounters, who are called Legion because there are so many. So I think,
they enter the pigs, and the pigs run off the cliff. I mean, this would make a great horror movie.
Exactly. And so the question to me is, why are stories like that in the Bible? And I think the fundamental reason I would give someone skeptical of horror is because the Bible is an incredibly honest work that does not pretend to us that we're not living in a fallen world. And as such, things like murder, possession, all these fears we have, fears of our own. That story of Legion can also be seen as, yes, a possession story, but also a possession of our fears of not being in control of our own minds, of psychological decay. These are real world fears. And if the Bible pretended like none of that existed, it would be hard to take it seriously as a guide for our lives. So I think that's part one, but then it's also part two is to say, okay, that's true, but that's not the end of the story for the Bible. So how does the Bible answer all of these particular horror stories that it presents with us? And I don't know that you can go one by one through everyone we've just listed and say, here's the answer, here's the answer. But the overall story is one of grace, of goodness overcoming this evil, of life overcoming death and bringing life to all. And in that sense, that message of grace would ring hollow if it didn't make space first for the horror it's answering. And so I did try to structure the book that way, not only breaking down different genres of horror, but asking, what fear does this genre explore? Where do we see that fear in the Bible? Where is the fear answered in the Bible? And how do these movies help us think through that? Now, not all the horror movies will offer an answer aligned with the one in the Bible. Like I said, horror movies are pretty bleak. Every once in a while, you will get a comforting answer. But it's that process of recognizing the horror in the world and then looking for and finding a response from God that watching horror movies can help us also experience.
Well, I'd like to dive into that a little bit more. And as a nod to some of my Baha'i friends, and this is also airing on something called the Clearwater Baha'i channel as one of our outlets. There's something called the Fire Tablet in the Baha'i faith. This is a long poem by Baha'u'llah, the founder. I'm just going to read the opening. In the name of God, the most ancient, the most great. Indeed, the hearts of the sincere are consumed in the fire of separation. This is hell, right? Separation from God is hell. We didn't even talk about hell when it comes to horror stories, right? But where is the gleaming of the light of thy countenance, O beloved of the worlds? And then it says, the bodies of thy chosen ones lie quivering on distant sands. So lest the Baha'is think, well, we don't have horror in our writings. Yeah, you do. The bodies of thy chosen ones lie quivering on thy distant sands. Where is the ocean of thy presence, O enchanter of the worlds? And later on, this is my favorite part of this. It repeats this refrain. It says, were it not for calamity, how would the sun of thy patience shine, O light of the worlds? There
you go. Yeah. Yeah.
But then here's the and then it has this this phrase, the wailer of the worlds. And the quote is, shalt thou weep, shalt thou wail, or shalt I wail? Nay, rather shall I weep at the fewness of thy champions. Right? So the question is, what do we do about all this, right? And so I want to now dive down into, you said they may not all be resolved, but I want to share my particular pet theory. You mentioned Cain and Abel, right? So Jesus was a master at flipping the script. Why? To bring new understanding, right? To take a look at something from that old, to my Jewish friends, I'm sorry, from the Hebrew scriptures, right? From the Torah, from the prophets. He would take something that was given and he would flip the script to give a new understanding. It is my considered opinion that the prodigal son story is the retelling of the Cain and Abel story, in which he flips the script and Cain has his redemption. Cain is the son who took his inheritance and left the father and squandered it on wine, women, and song. He ended up in a pigsty and said, my father's servants have it better than me. I'll go back and become a servant to my father. The father rushes out to embrace him while he's afar off, gives him a coat, slaughters the fatted calf, celebrates a party. And now Abel, the good son who stayed faithful and who was favored by the father, is jealous. So Abel becomes the jealous one. And the father turns to him and says, why are you jealous? Everything I have is yours. And this is even more true because Cain in the story squandered his inheritance. But he doesn't get a new inheritance, but he is embraced back. Everything the father has now belongs to Abel because Abel has not consumed his inheritance yet. So it works. You follow me? And this is kind of a redemption story that allows us to look at things differently. Is there some of that in horror? Because I think, Seinfeld was famous for being a show about nothing, and there's no moral lesson. And even in the final episode, the whole crew had never learned anything, right?
Yeah, right.
Do we actually learn things from horror movies, or is that not part of the script? Does it leave us in that dark space, and is that part of the lesson?
Yeah, I think most horror probably leaves us in the dark space. It doesn't necessarily mean they always have, unhappy endings, but there's always a bit of discomfort to it. That's just part of the genre. I would be careful about demanding like lessons from horror because it can be ironically, it can be a very moralistic genre. So in Fear Not, I have a chapter on, I call it sex as death. And it's all these movies like Friday the 13th, which we mentioned, which equate any sort of sexual activity with death. That's incredibly moralistic.
Yes, I've seen that where it has this like black and white morality that
Yes.
blurs any gray area that's very unhealthy.
Very unhealthy. And I would say, really, again, if you take the Bible into account in terms of sexuality, anti-biblical. That's sort of attitude towards human sexuality.
Well,
so,
it's like it takes one verse of the Bible and uses it as a proof text and as a hammer. Whereas, like I said, you have this prodigal son story that flips the script on Cain and Abel and allows you to say, well, Cain wasn't lost necessarily. In fact, God put a mark on him so that nobody could kill him, and he became a living lesson, right? He lived in exile, but anyone who killed Cain would be killed themselves. He did not grant us the ability to go out and become vigilantes.
yeah. And so when it comes to lessons in horror, I think it can get dicey. Now, that doesn't mean some can't offer comfort. I mentioned discomfort is where we're usually left. I think some can offer comfort. I would point to The Babadook. This is 2014 from a filmmaker, Jennifer Kent, and it is about a mother raising a very difficult young son on her own. Their, backstory involves tragedy. I won't get into it, but the boy finds this picture book that is kind of creepy, and by reading it, he somewhat unleashes this, you could call it a demon, this haunting, threatening presence. And this, of course, is psychological horror. It's standing in for this mother's feelings of being overwhelmed by her situation to the point of actually having negative, like very scary negative feelings towards her child. And that movie, I won't give it away, ends in an incredibly miraculous space of grace for that mother, and also stands in, the way I read it, again, I won't get into details, but as an example of how far the love of God goes for us when we are lost. And I watched The Babadook, especially having raised 2 kids and, thankfully had a lot of help doing that. But any parent has those, middle of the night moments where you're like, how am I going to get through this? I find it to be an incredibly comforting film by the time it gets to that point, even though it has led me through a path of familiar terror. I would also point to The Sixth Sense, which is an incredibly popular horror film, kind of an entry point horror film for a lot of people. M. Night Shyamalan, Bruce Willis. And I think
don't spoil it, even though everybody knows the story.
Will not. I'll just say, I think you can find an arc of redemption and comfort in that movie as well. Now, those are they're unique in those ways, but you can find that sort of experience in horror as well.
Well, speaking of 2 things, and I was going to also talk about you being in Scotland, but we'll save that for the next segment. I'll conclude this segment with this question. So there are all these different perspectives on what horror even is, right? So for me, one of the most memorable moments is Planet of the Apes and the final scene, which when I saw it in the movie theater when it first came out, I was, 13. That was powerful. in terms of leaving you in a moment of despair when Charlton Heston realizes the truth about the Planet of the Apes, that to me was a horror moment where he's like pounding his fist in the sand saying, and of course he always overacts, but it worked.
What? You're saying that's overacting? No, yeah, yes, I agree.
I'm not a film critic, so correct me if I'm wrong. Do I have a future in film criticism?
I think that's entirely fair. And yeah, it's interesting that to you, yeah, you'd consider that a horror film. This is an endless debate. What is or is not horror? You know, The Silence of the Lambs falls into this category.
Well, but look, I mean, they're being hunted down by monkeys on horseback and captured in nets. It's pretty horrific.
It is. It is. And even though most would probably classify it as science fiction, I think what you're describing offers another interesting way to think about horror. Is it more about your response and how it makes you feel, what it makes you think about your own life or the world at large? And if it provokes that sort of horror, then maybe it's fair to call it a horror film. At least it is for you, for sure.
Well, yeah, and I'm not saying it is or isn't, but it was an impactful moment. So tell me about that from the point of view of a film critic, because you mentioned The Sixth Sense, which similarly has like this moment of reveal, which almost rechristens the whole movie. There's a different one that's also not a horror, but Memento. Remember the movie Memento?
Yeah,
did you see that?
Sure.
That one's like rewriting the script every 2 minutes. And I love a movie like that where you have to watch it 6 times to figure out what's going on.
Yeah. The twist, using a twist in a movie, I think is common to horror. But it's also common to, its step sibling, which would be thrillers. Both of those employ twists very effectively. And for me, I like how you describe The Sixth Sense in that it rechristens. I think the good twists do that. They don't just surprise you or throw in something random. They make you rethink everything you've watched. And not only that, when you go through that exercise, you appreciate what you had watched in a new or different way. M. Night Shyamalan is famous for using twists a lot. And I think he gets a little bit of a bad rap for that because for the most part, not every film of his, they function that way, where they reorient your understanding of what you'd been watching. That is additive. It's not just for that moment of twist. It's for the entire experience. I think he does, for the most part, pull that off, and absolutely does in The Sixth Sense.
Well, very good. We're going to conclude there with this portion. When we come back, we're going to ask, why are you in Scotland and what's next on the horizon for you? Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with more of Josh Larson on Created in the Image of God.
The story began inside a prison cell, a silent room, a notebook, a man trying to understand the wreckage of his own life. He wrote everything by hand, every moment that broke him, every memory that refused to stay buried, every step that pushed him towards something different. The pages follow the weight of consequence, the pressure of truth, and the unexpected guidance that appeared in the middle of that darkness. Not miracles, just people, conversations, and decisions that slowly reshaped the direction of a damaged life. A raw account of collapse, survival, and slow reconstruction. A journey carved in ink, built line by line, inside a room meant to break him. The Men from the Medium, by Daniel Gray. To learn more, visit Daniel Gray's Facebook page or scan the QR code for details.
Welcome back to the final segment of the show with Josh Larson. I don't want this to end. I'm enjoying it so much. I'm learning so much. So Josh, what are you doing in Scotland and what's next for you?
Yeah, I've been here since September pursuing a master's in theology and the arts. So it's at the University of St. Andrews, and they have an incredibly unique program, which is why I traveled so far from Chicago, where it is all about arts, culture, and incorporating that with theology. It's the Institute for Theology, Imagination, and the Arts. And it's really, for me, at the midpoint of my life, this is my only post-grad experience, Previous to this was just undergrad, a bachelor's in communication arts and English. And I've done a lot of learning on the job throughout the first half of my career, I would say. Especially, I mentioned that position at Think Christian. It was a lot of reading theology on my own, guided by, some of my colleagues there at the media ministry I was working at, and enjoyed that quite a bit. But I wanted more of an academic foundation for some of the thinking in this area that I hope to still do. Both of my books, as I mentioned, have been in this arena. So Movies Are Prayers, my first book, and now Fear Not, Christian Appreciation of Horror Movies, are in this field, and I'm proud of the work there. But a common response I would get to people is, I love this, I wish there'd been more of it. And generally what they meant is longer, yes, covered more movies, but I think they meant maybe go a little deeper as well. And so getting this education, learning from people who this is their career, theology and the arts, the professors and instructors here, is what I hope will be a firmer foundation even for future projects, perhaps books, who knows what it'll be in this area. And the first semester has been wonderful in doing that. So many great readings, understandings of, thinkers in this field and artwork in general. And so I can't wait to finish it up this next semester. And then I have a dissertation I'll be writing over the summer.
Well, I remember after I resigned from the ministry, I went into business and I kind of got into technology. And through some amazing circumstances, I will say divine assistance, I ended up working for Deloitte Consulting, which is one of the premier consulting firms. And while I was at Deloitte, I went and got an MBA. And while I was getting my MBA, I was like, how did I get anywhere close to where I am? and how have I even been in any way successful without knowing all this stuff? Did you have a little bit of that experience?
That is so funny. Yes, I'll just say yes. While emphasizing, that I'm incredibly proud of both of those books, and I think they stand up on their own, and honestly speak to a general readership that I still hope to speak to. And I think I'm going to have to be careful going forward, holding this knowledge, but not falling into academic jargon, because I really do want to. I've enjoyed this experience of academia, but I think coming up through journalism, my space is more with general listeners or readers. And so I think it was good that both of those books are written in that style. I've been able to connect with people who would never read an academic journal, piece, or heaven forbid, an academic book. But they're very much interested in these ideas. So yes, I have had that experience where I think, man, I would like to have included this aspect to the book or something like that. But I think they stand up on their own still. I do hope the stuff I do from here on out might be even richer.
Awesome. So, what is the vision, mission, purpose behind the program of Theology in the Arts? What is their raison d'être, to show off my French?
Yeah. It's great. The way they describe it is that this program is for artists who want to incorporate thinking about God into their craft, or it's for theologians who want to find ways to incorporate art into their ministry. Now, you may have noticed neither of those positions describes me. So I'm sort of like right at the cross section of that as a film critic.
You're a natural interpreter between the jocks and the geeks in your world, right? So are there like jocks and geeks? They're the theologians and the artists, and you're in the middle?
It's mostly people I've found who are interested, I would say, in the theology first, but even those folks all have an art practice of their own, whether it's music or writing poetry. They're actively engaged in art in some way. So yeah, it's not so much separate groups as much as one person might lean a little more towards one side than the other. And yeah, I've found, that maybe I'm not in their target demo, who they describe, who they're looking for, but I think I'm a bit of an odd duck in general. I don't know where I would fit to be honest with you. And I've been pretty comfortable here, even though I'm not fully a theologian or fully an artist.
Well, is it sort of a rich, fertile ground of theological ideas, which is, I mean, I love art. I love music. For me, you know, it's less movies and more music, as evidenced by the obtuse, obscure Frank Zappa reference. I've bit my tongue to not bring in other musical references into this, but still, my passion, my love is that theology, right? The idea that perhaps the prodigal son might be a retelling of the Cain and Abel story, which is, maybe there's a little bit of ego there because it's an original idea, but I think there's a value to it, a depth, right? So are you finding that, is there some kind of rich, fertile theological exploration going on as a result of this pollination between
Yeah,
art?
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of the readings we're given are, some familiar, some not to me. And so that's been a lot to get through. I'm a slow reader. And so, so keeping up with that has been a bit of a challenge, but it has been rewarding. And then also has been rewarding is thinking about art in this way. Particularly, I will say, a lot of the artworks we focus on are specifically religious work. Not all, but a lot of them. My instinct and interest has long been, how can the non-religious art speak theologically? And so because of that, I've kind of appreciated religious art, but never really spent too much time on it. Is kind of like, yeah, I know that's a stained glass window of this scene from the Bible, or, but so I've appreciated spending more guided, focused time on the history behind some of this art. And that's something I didn't quite expect and have been grateful for.
So given when does this program end for you? How much longer are you there?
It's a year program. So start in September, and then the dissertation is due at the end of this summer.
Have you decided on your dissertation?
So funny you asked that. I got an email today that we need to get our proposal in probably by the end of the week. So I have a couple ideas I'm circling around. I need to make a final call on that pretty soon.
Anything you can share, and I'm not pressuring you, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Oh, no, because I don't want to have that in my head. But I said it on the show with Wade on Creating the Image of God, but definitely movie focused. I can tell you that.
Well, I will follow up with a link of that fire tablet, because there might be a couple of things in there that might jog something. Just that juxtaposition of the quivering bodies laying on the sands, and where are you, God?
I was going to jump in because that piece about the loneliness of being separated from God, we probably are out of time to get into this, but in Fear Not, I write about the slasher genre as being all about fear of being alone. And I write about loneliness a lot there. And the root cause of the theological understanding of loneliness is that separation from God, which is the root of all human loneliness. So when I heard you read that, I thought, wow, that's an interesting point of connection.
Well, and another one is simply the Genesis story, right? So Adam and Eve disobey, and then they hide. And then there's this question, which I love: who told you you were naked? And that question doesn't mean who let the cat out of the bag that I created naked human beings. That's not who fed you the idea that there was some shame in what I created. And the result is you got to kill animals, which is a bloody act, and clothe yourself in their skins.
Yeah, a little bit of horror there as well.
Right. So anyway, we're out of time, but this has just been amazing. Thank you so much for being here and sharing all this. And for those of you who want to check out Josh's work, where can they find you?
I do have a website where I regularly review films, larsononfilm.com, and there's a newsletter there you can subscribe to for free. But the podcast is what I'm mostly doing right now, Film Spotting, and you can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. We're on YouTube as well, so check out Film Spotting. And again, that's more for mainstream audiences, so general movie coverage. Otherwise, if the book sounds interesting to you, please check them out. I am still proud of them. Movies Are Prayers and Fear Not.
Awesome. And what would you like to leave our audience with here in the last moments?
If you're intrigued by horror after this conversation, I would say a good starting point might be The Sixth Sense, to dip your toes in that water. It is creepy. It is scary. It's not extremely explicit, and it's incredibly rewarding. So if this has intrigued you in the horror genre, The Sixth Sense might be a good place to start.
It's interesting because whereas I kind of hinted at the Planet of the Apes maybe being a horror movie, I would not have called The Sixth Sense a horror movie, but I guess it is.
It's a ghost story. I mean, we
Yeah.
can say that without giving away too much. It's definitely a ghost story.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Josh. And we'll be continuing to follow you in your career. And maybe we'll have you back at the conclusion and talk about your dissertation. For the rest of you, there's one more thing, and that is to watch the sneak peek of next week's show. And meanwhile, in your horror moments, don't forget you are created in the image of God, and God loves his creation. We'll see you next week. Hey everyone, Wade Franson back from Hawaii and vacation, fresh and with a quickly receding tan, to have a sneak peek recording with our upcoming guest for episode 124, airing on January 20th. His name is Mark Silk, and he has been active for decades at the intersection of religion, politics, society, and he's Jewish by background, and he has opinions and perspectives that are important and valuable in this day and age where it seems we have a culture war on every imaginable topic. You can barely bring up anything in conversation that somebody doesn't turn into a political item. So, Mark, welcome to the studio. Why is it that this intersection is your focus?
Well, I started out as actually a historian of the Middle Ages, and by hook or by crook, I ended up writing about contemporary American things. And I found that I was very interested in how religion seemed to be becoming more important in American public life, really at the end of the 1970s and the early 1980s. I began working on that question, and really sort of applying my background in sort of the history of religion in the West to the American scene at the point at which we were starting to see really the rise of the religious right.
Well, this whole history thing is critical and important, right? We all know the standard soundbite of those who fail to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And when we hear middle age history, we think ancient times. But as a Jewish person, that's just an inflection point in the history of the Jewish people, right? That was a time when suddenly Christianity was reaching a point of challenge, right? So how does that depth of history, both on the Jewish side and the sort of Christian side in the Middle Ages, how does that inform your view of today? And are we making the same mistakes today?
Well, if we were having this conversation a few years ago, I would say we have overcome mistakes. In many ways, the United States, in the last part of the 20th century, became a place very open to religious diversity, not just Christians and Jews, but people of other faiths as well. In the wake of immigration to this country from places like India and so on, you have a variety of faiths that really Americans have accepted. I think we've seen some pulling back from that kind of openness in recent years, and so in that sense, I suppose you could say that some of the ways in which in the Middle Ages, really in the High Middle Ages and later, hostility to those of other faiths became more pronounced as medieval society became sort of more organized and militarized in a coherent way.
Well, and we didn't even talk about Mark's credentials, which are substantial, but tune in on the January 20th show, and we'll dive deep into this topic, and we will explore whether or not we are moving 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or whether there's something more ominous on the horizon, and we see the unfolding of 1984 in Brave New World, books that I was required to read when I was in high school. I don't know about today's youth, but you're not going to want to miss the show with Mark Silk on January 20th, 8 p.m. Central Time on Created in the Image of God. We'll see you there.